I liked Elvis, Gene Vincent, Carl Perkins, and rockabilly. Bob was a Pete Seeger follower who played for us. John Lennon learned to play a banjo-tuned guitar. He made me proud. Roger McGuinn was quiet. He didn't act like a star, never made outrageous statements, and never sought the spotlight. The jingle-jangle of Mr. Tambourine Man wouldn't have echoed without him. Bob Dylan may never have played electric guitar, and the folk rock revolution may never have happened. McGuinn was a quiet man who changed the 60s music scene. He was a 12-string guitarist who could turn folk into rock while retaining its soul, a storyteller who spoke through his strings, carrying loneliness, yearning, and a delicate beauty that crowds rarely noticed. But his delicacy made him feel out of place in a louder music scene. He stayed when the Byrds broke up because he believed in the music, not ambition. After fame waned, he left. No retirement announcement, no farewell tour, just disappeared. Returned softly with old folk music freely uploaded online from a modest space. Roger McGuinn died. If you've ever heard Turn, Turn, Turn and had your heart drop for something you couldn't name, that was him. This is the story of the man who made folk rock sing, then left the spotlight without saying goodbye. Early life. Roger McGuinn was born July 13, 1942, in Chicago. War and social transformation engulfed America. But one item was always abundant in the modest McGuinn home: imagination. His parents, James and Dorothy McGuinn, wrote science fiction and worked in advertising. Despite their poverty and lack of artistic status, they pushed their little boy to read, ask questions, and think beyond the present. That made an artist constantly listen, always want to tell a tale, and always question the obvious. Roger loved music, especially the radio, from childhood. Songs were absorbed, not just heard. A lonely, introverted person found spiritual nourishment in the Weavers, Pete Seeger, and classical music. A turning point occurred at 13. He watched Elvis Presley on TV. The crowd's screams and Elvis's guitar hold fascinated him. The next day, he requested a guitar from his parents. Book and science fiction made way for strings and rhythm, a new language. Roger struggled in school. He was dreamy, inattentive, and sometimes perceived as slow by teachers. They didn't realize that this youngster lived in a universe where music, not lectures, communicated everything. It was a lonely childhood, but not traumatic. No close pals, no playground laughter, just a silent guy in his room. Taught oneself to pluck strings, decipher chords, and write emotions as if rewriting himself through music. Silence, inventiveness, and a desire to connect shaped his career. Roger McGuinn rose to fame without learning music. Learned to survive. In the loud world of rock and roll, he communicated his narrative with the softest, most honest sounds. Early career. As Roger McGuinn entered his 20s, many of his peers joined emerging rock bands. He differed. He chose folk music for its honesty, not its popularity. He felt like he was discovering bits of himself in the raw, acoustic melodies and stories of workers, farmers, and soldiers. McGuinn studied fingerpicking, American folk music, and sound storytelling at Chicago's Old Town School of Folk Music. Instead of becoming a star, he learned to be a torchbearer. He used music to preserve a dying culture, not gain fame. He began performing with the Limelighters, Chad Mitchell Trio, and Bobby Darin in the late 1950s. The individual who introduced McGuinn to professional music. Darin inspired him to learn arrangement, composition, and studio work to create his own sound. McGuinn traveled to Los Angeles in the early 1960s, when the folk movement was flourishing and clashing with rock and roll. He knew the future wasn't in picking a side then. Blending both was key. He played at LA clubs like the Troubadour, a refuge for new sounds. There, he met Gene Clark and David Crosby, who changed his life. 3 personalities, 3 musics. Their feeling was that folk and rock didn't have to be uninteresting or superficial. Their band was the Jet Set in 1964. This became the Byrds, a moniker that soared but promised to fly and break free from previous boundaries. Roger McGuinn, a shy folk club guitarist, was about to change a genre with a 12-string Rickenbacker and a concept no one had ever thought of, turning Bob Dylan's poetry into a rock success. Revolution was imminent. McGuinn tuned its strings. Glory and breakage. After Mr. Tambourine Man hit the airwaves in 1965, music changed. Bob Dylan composed the lyrics, but the Byrds, with Gene Clark's soaring vocals and Roger McGuinn's ringing 12-string Rickenbacker, made it a revolution, electrifying folk tune with psychedelic tones and pop melody. McGuinn moved from a tradition keeper to a force for a generation overnight. Every flight, so high as turbulence. Turn, 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 8 Miles High, Fifth Dimension, and Younger Than Yesterday were hits for the Byrds. They embodied folk wisdom and 1960s defiance, and McGuinn's 12-string guitar always tapped into a generation on the brink of separation. Within the band, tranquility was unusual. After years of conflict with McGuinn and Crosby, lead songwriter Gene Clark resigned in 1966. Part was creative control. He was afraid of flying, which was impractical for a touring band. The Byrds lost a delicate heart when Clark left, and McGuinn became songwriter, lead vocalist, and artistic leader. Another breakup occurred when David Crosby became frustrated as his suggestions were rejected. He sought to make the band's music more political, complicated, and psychedelic. McGuinn sought grace, restraint, and accuracy. Two big egos, two different visions. McGuinn and bassist Chris Hillman sacked Crosby in 1967 following a stormy Monterey Pop Festival performance. From there, the Byrds slowly faded. Members came and departed. McGuinn, the last, strove to preserve the spirit with recordings like the notorious Byrd Brothers, Sweetheart of the Rodeo, and Ballad of Easy Rider. He tried country, jazz, and early electronica, continuously trying to remain ahead, but the audience had already moved on. After nearly a decade of ups and downs, the Byrds disbanded in 1973. Despite being pioneers, they couldn't escape the law that governs all great bands. Higher altitudes make breaking easier. Roger McGuinn, who formerly led the band with sound and vision, had one unresolved question. What was left to say after all the glory and wreckage if there were no Byrds? Career, personal crises, solo. After the Byrds disbanded in 1973, Roger McGuinn began his solo path with two hands full of experience and a heart full of doubt. He was no longer a youthful musician trying to change music. He survived a decade of brokenness and war. The 12-string Rickenbacker was an indelible mark on him. His 1973 solo album Roger McGuinn featured Bob Dylan, David Crosby, and Graham Nash and was honest. The music ranged from folk to rock, country, and psychedelia, but the audience had moved on. McGuinn felt out of place in a glam rock and disco era, telling stories with rustic sounds amid a chaotic musical sea. He followed with Peace on You, 1974, Roger McGuinn and Band, 1975, Cardiff Rose, 1976, and Thunderbird, 1977. None were commercially successful. He was respected by critics but not by younger listeners. Jolly Roger and Dreamland were overshadowed by dance music and MTV's dazzling images. After many failed attempts, Roger McGuinn developed a subtle, enduring personal dilemma. No scandals, substance addiction, or self-destruction, just prolonged confusion. In one interview, he said, "I had fame, independence, creative power, but I still felt empty. My purpose in life was lost." McGuinn wondered if music was salvation without Byrds to guide and no audience to listen, or an excuse for loneliness, and just when everything seemed to be vanishing, a new road silently opened. From faith, not a record label or stage. From then on, Roger McGuinn sought life rather than a job, a reason to live rather than an audience to legitimize his existence. Soulful comeback, not charted. Faith reappeared and left the spotlight. In the late 1970s, as many of his peers were consumed with tours, million-dollar contracts, and stimulants to avoid creative tiredness, Roger McGuinn quietly took a different path. He rejoined faith. After years of exhaustion and doubt, McGuinn had a spiritual awakening in 1978. A daily accumulation of emptiness drove him to confront himself, not a great fall or spectacular disaster. He remembered kneeling in prayer one solitary night, no longer seeking fame but aching for a tranquility he'd lost long ago. Not loud or evangelical, he became a fervent Christian. But faith changed everything. He lived, thought, and wrote music. He and his wife, Camilla, moved to an RV and traveled across America, doing acoustic shows in small venues and sharing old stories to connect people, not sell tickets. Record labels, promotion, and market strategy are gone. McGuinn no longer pursued music professionally. A spiritual journey. The Folk Den Project, founded in 1995, preserves and shares traditional folk music, one every month, recorded and uploaded by McGuinn for free. Voice, guitar, and story, no record deals, marketing, or noise reduction. "I want these tunes to last," he said. "They're cultural memory. I'm just trying to keep something alive for the next generation." In a music world increasingly driven by trends and clicks, Roger McGuinn all but vanished from the media radar. But he didn't vanish from music. He simply chose to exist on a deeper level. No TV appearances, no commercial Byrds reunions, no steady album releases. But each month, a new folk song would quietly emerge from that old website, like a whisper from an artist who never really left, just chose to speak more softly. McGuinn didn't choose seclusion. He chose simplicity. He didn't withdraw out of failure, but because he had found what he truly needed. In a world growing ever louder, Roger McGuinn's silence resounded like a statement. Music doesn't always need to be heard loudly. Sometimes it needs to be heard with the heart, legacy, and influence. Roger McGuinn was never the name that made crowds scream. He didn't have solo hits topping the charts, no grand stadium tours, no wild tales like many of his rock contemporaries. But his influence, deep and enduring, has traveled farther than any drumbeat, synth loop, or spotlight could ever reach. The signature sound of his 12-string Rickenbacker, bright, ringing, echoing like a voice from another space, was McGuinn's secret weapon. Before him, the electric guitar was a tool for noise, power, and spectacle. But McGuinn turned it into a storytelling instrument, subtle, haunting, and poetic. George Harrison once admitted that it was hearing Mr. Tambourine Man that mesmerized him and led him to buy an identical Rickenbacker. That jingle-jangle sound became a defining feature in Beatles tracks like If I Needed Someone and Ticket to Ride. Tom Petty, who led a new wave of American rock in the 80s, openly said that his career began at the point where McGuinn left off. And it wasn't just the sound, but the narrative style of songwriting that left its mark. Artists like R.E.M., Wilco, the Jayhawks, and even early U2 were shaped by the melodic structure and lyrical storytelling found in McGuinn's and the Byrds recordings. But perhaps the most remarkable thing about Roger McGuinn isn't his technical legacy, it's his musical philosophy. When the industry chased trends, he turned back to nameless folk ballads. When artists used their voices to sell themselves, he used his to preserve culture. Folked In, that seemingly modest project, has now lasted nearly 30 years, documenting hundreds of traditional songs and giving future generations access to melodies that might have otherwise vanished. In 1991, Roger McGuinn and the original members of the Byrds were inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. In his speech, he didn't mention glory. He didn't thank the industry. He simply said, "We were just storytellers, and I hope the music keeps telling those stories after we're gone." And it has. You don't need to be loud to leave a legacy. Roger McGuinn proved that sometimes, the ones who choose to speak softly are the ones the world listens to the most. Life today, Roger McGuinn is at an age when most artists have settled into silence. But he keeps moving. Quietly. Without big stages. Yet every step, every small performance carries a simple belief. Music still matters. If it comes from the heart. In 2024 and 2025, McGuinn continues to tour regularly with his songs and story series. These aren't typical concerts, they're intimate conversations. He sings, but also shares memories. His early days in Los Angeles, his first encounter with Bob Dylan, or why he chose folk music instead of chasing hits. The tour stops stretch across the United States, from the Bankhead Theater in California to the Wildey Theater in Illinois, from Delaware to Massachusetts. No sold-out box offices, no flashy banners, just middle-aged fans sitting quietly, listening to a man tell stories through strings and memory. Alongside him on every journey is Camilla, his wife, partner, manager, and fellow traveler of more than 40 years. They live in an RV, like pilgrims of a faith with no temple, a faith called folk. McGuinn once said, "We don't live to perform. We perform so we can live the way we believe is right." When he's not on tour, McGuinn continues to maintain the Folked In Project, a website he launched in 1995. Over 300 traditional folk songs have been recorded, transcribed, and uploaded for free. To him, it's not just a collection, it's the preservation of America's memory. Songs once passed down orally across generations now live again in his warm voice and familiar strumming. McGuinn's life today is nearly disconnected from the modern entertainment world. He has no noisy social media, no live streams, no arguments over the Grammys or Billboard. But each month, faithfully, a new song is added to Folk Denver. Like a whisper from someone who doesn't need fame, only the hope of being heard and remembered. At 82, he speaks openly about aging. He doesn't try to extend you through image or illusions. His hair is silver. He's vegetarian. He wakes early, practices guitar daily. He prays. He writes music and sometimes still receives handwritten letters from young people who learn to play through his project. Roger McGuinn doesn't live in the past. He lives in the present. But it's a present of his own making, free from templates. A small world where acoustic music, simplicity, and faith coexist peacefully. And maybe that's why he's still walking, still singing, still telling stories. Not to be recognized one more time, but to preserve a quiet corner of the world where everything began and never truly ended. Roger McGuinn was never a symbol of glamour. He didn't live to become a legend, but it was precisely his quiet choices, steadfast spirit, and refusal to compromise that made him one of the most respected artists of his generation. From a shy boy enchanted by radio in Chicago to the founder of the Byrds, the band that transformed how the world perceived folk rock. From a guitarist who played with heart more than technique to a man who quietly helped shape the sound of the 1960s, Roger McGuinn followed a path no one else quite walked. He never fell into addiction, never lost himself to fame, and never shouted to be remembered. Instead, he told stories through music, through faith, through cross-country travels with his soulmate, through an old website that uploads a single folk song each month, no likes or shares needed. He didn't choose to be forgotten. He chose to become memory. Roger McGuinn's story doesn't end with a final hit or a grand farewell tour. It closes, if it ever truly closes, with the gentle sound of a guitar on a quiet afternoon in a small town, where he still sings for a few dozen people. But to those who have truly listened, who've let his music reach them, Roger McGuinn never really left. If you believe that artists like Roger McGuinn, quiet, enduring, and deeply human, still deserve to be remembered, please like, subscribe, and turn on the bell so you won't miss the next story. Which song by the Byrds or Roger McGuinn has stayed with you over the years? Share your memory in the comments, because music is how we hold on to what matters most. See you in the next video.